Hi, welcome to Love the Goal, the podcast where we explore what it means to put the love of Jesus into practice in our daily lives and actions, not just loving those who love us in return, but loving our enemies and the stranger and the foreigner and the sick and those at the margins of society, as Jesus commands us to do. My name is Reverend Chris Heckert. I'm the host of this podcast, and my guest today is a dear friend and colleague, Dr. Ashley Boggan. Ashley is the chief historian for the United Methodist Church, and she and I, our friendship and working relationship go back to a pilgrimage in England that we shared in 2022, where we were also discovering Methodist history. In this podcast, we're going to talk about Ashley's experience with the love of God and practicing it. She's also going to help us to rediscover a little bit what it means to make love the goal of our lives in the lens of the founder of Methodism, John Wesley. We talk a bit about the early Methodist movement, which really took root in 1738 and 1739, and not just something in history, but something that has reverberations to today. Our theology, our understanding of trying not just believe in Jesus, but also live as Jesus teaches us to do. And a lot of that comes from our Wesleyan roots and heritage. I know you're going to enjoy this interview with Ashley, and I pray that you're inspired and even challenged to make love the goal of your life. Let's jump into the interview. Ashley, hello. Welcome to Love the Goal, the podcast where we talk about putting the love of Jesus into action in our everyday lives. I'm grateful to have you on here, my friend.
Thank you, Chris. It's so good to be with you all and to join this podcast as a guest. I'm sometimes on the other side doing the hosting, and I'm always more nervous as a guest.
I love the Untied Methodism podcast that you host. I should introduce you just a little bit. You are Dr. Ashley Boggan, the General Secretary of the General Commission of Archives and History of the United Methodist Church. I don't know if you still have business cards, but that's a mouthful of a title. But if you wouldn't mind, for our friends who are watching or listening, who are you? Who is Dr. Ashley Boggan?
I am a big old metho nerd, so I thoroughly enjoy geeking out on Methodist history, on reading Methodist history, on writing Methodist history, discussing it, living it. So, I wander around with John Wesley bobbleheads and put him in all sorts of precarious situations. Beyond that, who am I? I am a mom of two little kids. I'm a laywoman from Arkansas who's now living in New Jersey. And yeah.
You and I met in a pretty cool place, kind of out of the way place, on a Wesley pilgrimage, for me, that really made way for this path that I'm on right now, working on an academic program. Just tell us a little bit about where you and I met and became friends with a few other folks.
So, like you said, right, it was on a Wesley pilgrimage a couple of years ago, I think in 2022. And there are lots of different Wesley pilgrimages out there. Seminaries do them, bishops do them. This one that we did was run by Discipleship Ministries. And, you spend 10 days kind of traveling around England, seeing some of our most historic sites, the places where John and Charles Wesley were born, the church where they were baptized and confirmed, the university where they were trained, and then, the churches where they preached. And so I think we were traveling together, with about probably 28, 30 other people experiencing these places. And it was the first time I'd seen a lot of these places. And so I had the privilege of wearing a pilgrim hat and not necessarily my GS hat. And so really got to experience it for the first time and see that history just come to life.
It was really interesting for me. Behind, I think on the shelf right here behind me, are a lot of my seminary books on John Wesley and the Methodists, the people called Methodists, and reading about a lot of those places. Being there, it connected a lot of dots, and it also brought some realities to bear and connecting with current situation here. I think the moment that I knew that you and I would be friends, along with a couple others we were with, was at the New Room in Bristol. And I didn't know anything about Bristol, wasn't planning on and didn't think anything of it. And I have to say that was the most significant place that we visited and the most significant experience. Wouldn't you agree with that?
I would. I mean, so, as kind of a Methodist historian and someone who teaches Methodist history, we always, well, we probably don't always, but a lot of us learn about kind of the three rises of Methodism, right? And Bristol happens after those rises, where Wesley begins Methodism in Oxford, and then it changes in Georgia, and then it changes again in London. And Bristol and the New Room happened after that. And for so long, probably reading the same books that are on your shelf and teaching them, the revival in Bristol was kind of like this thing that I just skipped over. And I was like, oh yeah, and then he did some stuff in Bristol. But being there, and I think sitting in the New Room, hearing David Worthington read from his journal, and just it really sunk in a different way as to how John Wesley's ministry, how he's called a ministry, and then his vision for the people called Methodists transformed in that town over a span of a few days.
Well, you set the stage for us. So 1739, John Wesley gets an invitation. He's in London. He goes to Bristol. His friend calls him, says, you've got to see what's happening. He thinks he's taking a short trip. He doesn't go back home for quite a while, and everything changes. What happened?
Yeah, so John gets this kind of letter, I guess, from George Whitefield to come and see what's going on. And he hesitates a little bit, but he goes. And when he gets there, I think he was expecting to arrive to, probably a large crowd in a church or some other formal setting. And George Whitefield had been preaching in the fields. And not just any fields, but like coal mining fields. And so John gets there and he sees this, and he's taken aback at first to this, quote, strange way of preaching in the fields. And, for John, up until that point, he really had followed the preaching standards of his day. He preferred preaching in a pulpit, in those parishes that had the two pulpit, the high one and the low one for preaching. And preaching outdoors within the Church of England wasn't really breaking the rules. It was just something you didn't do, right? It was frowned upon.
It broke decorum, really.
It broke decorum. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so he sees George doing this, and George isn't only preaching in a field, but the people that he's preaching to were people that typically were not in your sanctuary on a Sunday morning. Right? These were coal miners. They were lower class. They often worked on Sundays and didn't have the luxury to take Sunday off to go to church. They were dirty, covered in coal ash. And here's George preaching to them in a field, and John sees the effect that it's having on the coal miners, because this is the first time that they've heard the message of God's love and love of them, of all people. Right. And they're being told that they're worthy of God's love. And so John sees this. And
I don't want to interrupt you, but what's the message that they would have heard of inside the church at that time? Why is this so, provocative?
Well, I think inside the church back then, they would have, the message that was being told wasn't as radically inclusive of God's love. It was more of kind of the contrast we always say is preaching to the head versus preaching to the heart, right? And so it would have been a very kind of intellectual sermon, elaborating upon scripture, often using words that were too large for your common people to understand. And John is able, when he first preaches in the fields, to make the message of God's love one that appealed to the heart. And he did it in quote unquote plain speech, right? Or the speech that most people can relate to. And I think he did it in kind of a very similar manner, when we think of kind of Jesus in the parables, right? Of telling it in stories that everyday people can relate to, and not necessarily getting lost in grand theological arguments and doctrine.
I think there's at the New Room, that's when I felt this connection to now, because the new room is this beautiful, old, peaceful building in the midst of a busy city. And I feel like there's a similar absence of younger folks inside of churches, but also a real need for the same sort of message of love. Can you just tell us a little bit about the new room? So Wesley was probably thought he was going to go back to London quickly, stayed for quite a while, and then the new room became the first Methodist building ever. And for what purpose?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's always so ironic that, he discovers his love of field preaching and then builds a building. I always think that's funny. But, he starts building the building pretty quickly, like within, I think, a month or two of beginning field preaching. And it's because there are so many people who don't have a space that they feel comfortable going to continue to hear of God's love, or to have class meetings. And it's in Bristol right after field preaching and right alongside building the new room that John Wesley begins to experiment with bands, right? Those really intimate groups of 4 to 6 people who really hold each other accountable to God's love and living out God's love in this world. And so he starts building the new room, and it functions as a preaching house, a medical dispensary, a library, a place for community to just come and gather. It had apartment buildings up top. And it was really this multifunctional space that there weren't very many of back then. One of my favorite illustrations is with the new room. It had wooden benches that you could push to the side of the walls if you needed to use the floor space in a creative way. And then you could also move those benches back in for preaching.
So this wasn't a church. It didn't replace the Anglican church.
No.
It became different, right?
It was different. In fact, one of the few times its doors would have been closed was Sunday morning, because John Wesley wanted to make sure that they weren't being labeled dissenters. And so in order to ensure that people aren't coming to the Methodist preaching house on Sunday, but we're going to the Anglican parish to hear from Anglican priests and to receive the sacraments, that the new room would have been closed early on Sunday mornings when we typically think of having church. So that's one of those spaces where Wesley is doing something radical even inside of a building, in that he's talking about how do we do church that isn't focused on Sunday morning.
So Methodism, these are my words, but Methodism in its birth was the understanding that the word meets people where they are and immediately brings people into community. Would you agree with that? And so,
yes.
So the premise of this podcast is really to talk about that. That for John Wesley, he talked about and wrote a lot about Christian perfection. I'm not comfortable with that term, and I like language used by 12-step recovery groups that says we seek spiritual progress, not perfection, not spiritual perfection, which I think is very Wesleyan in the understanding, because I will never be perfect, but I'm moving in the direction. And I think a way to articulate that is to say that love becomes the goal of our life. Jesus commands us to love God, love neighbor, love one another. And so I just want to shift a little bit to you, Ashley, about your own experience of God's love that's driven you to do this work in the context of the church. So has there been a time in your life where you've personally experienced God's love in a profound or real way?
I would, I really don't have a solid specific time or event that I can point to, but, I was raised by 2 ordained clergy persons in the United Methodist Church. And so my experience of feeling God's love was very gradual, very progressive in terms of, progressing through different stages. And, one of the places and spaces, I think, growing up as a double PK, my parents served the same congregation for over 20 years, was singing in my mom's choir. And that for me, there are just certain hymns or anthems that just hit different. And you feel a different connection with the people you're singing alongside. You feel a different connection with God through the words and the music that's coming out of you, and you feel a different connection with the congregation, and you can see how they're affected by some of the anthems, at least. So there were probably a couple times growing up where through singing I felt kind of transformed by God's love, kind of, but it wouldn't have been the same experience without knowing the people I was singing with, and probably without my parents leading the choir, or at least my mom leading the choir.
So love is an experience as much as it is an idea.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. And it's at least kind of in that situation, it was very contextual. Yeah.
Have you found ever that practicing the love of God takes you to uncomfortable or challenging places?
Yes. So growing up, we did a lot of mission trips. And so, I'll talk about two examples, one from growing up and one from now. So my father started a mission project called Delta Mission Project, and it went into the southeast of Arkansas, which is the Delta. And it's one of the poorest, or it's some of the poorest counties in Arkansas, if not in the South or the whole country. Food insecurity is a big problem down there. And we went, there were probably 30 of us high schoolers, went down to Lake Chico, and we're working with their food pantry, doing organizing, restocking, things like that. And I remember having to use the restroom. It's summer, it's southeast Arkansas, it's over 100 degrees, we're all chugging Gatorade. And I go to the restroom that they have in the food pantry, and there's a sign on it that says out of order. And so I go and I ask the people who are running the food pantry, who staff it, where can I use the restroom? And they look at me and they say, oh, it's not out of order for you, honey. And one of those, that was one of those spaces where we all kind of, I think I went and told one of the youth counselors about it. And we finished up our work there, but then the youth group sat down and talked about, how none of us really had kind of encountered that level of exclusion or racism in our backyards, and had been, I don't know what the right words are for it, but it was one of those spaces where we were all kind of uncomfortable in that moment of realizing what was going on and how the restrooms were okay for us to use, but not others. But we also had to continue working in the food pantry to finish out the mission that we'd promised we would do, and the ministry we'd promised we'd do. But then we were really confused and concerned afterwards as to, is this okay? Is what we did okay? Is being in ministry with this food pantry okay? Or how can we work with them or alongside them to change some of their attitudes? Or, it was all of these questions about race and being socially engaged and spreading God's love that as a 15-year-old, I had not had up until that moment.
And this is not 1964, right?
No, this would have been early 2000, so probably like 2002. We'll say 2002. So it was just so shocking, and a lot of that speaks to my white privilege growing up in a city, in a largely suburban area, that I hadn't really seen that or encountered that before. But that was one of those spaces where it really was hard to want to go back the next day and continue to bring God's love through that food pantry. So,
let me just ask, knowing what you know now and with your lived experience, what does love look like in that moment? What does love look like?
Ooh. I have two answers. One would be my personal answer, one would be my professional answer. So professionally, this was a Methodist food pantry. So, I might put on my historian and theologian hat and talk about how, Wesley was about breaking down barriers and making sure that people had equal access to the basic necessities of life, including restrooms, no matter what, especially at a food pantry, right? Like, this is supposed to be a place to help people, not help them so far as they're willing to go, but not to make themselves uncomfortable in sharing a restroom with somebody. My personal, strong advocate part would have torn the sign down and went around the neighborhood handing out flyers saying, "Hey, here's a good bathroom to go use."
I don't think those are mutually exclusive.
I know, but there's some you can get away with a little bit easier than others.
Yeah, and when you're 15, you may not feel that you have that freedom.
Yeah.
Did you have another experience of love you wanted to share?
Yeah. So I think, today, one of the spaces where taking out kind of the love of God that requires me to be uncomfortable is actually kind of in my daily professional life now. I am not a public speaker. I don't like public speaking. And yet my job now is mostly public speaking.
And you're amazing at it, just for the record.
Thanks. You never want to feel my hands when I'm public speaking. They are sweaty. But, it's kind of putting myself in these situations that I would never seek out. I always kind of saw myself as a historian who did research. That's why I love archives, and wrote, because then you don't have to talk to people or engage with them. And now I'm doing all these speaking gigs, where it's in front of sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds of people. But it's just like kind of Wesley was called to the field. I feel called to these teaching kind of platforms in order to remind Methodists, and specifically United Methodists, that our entire reason for being in this world, not only as Methodists, but as Christians, is to take God's love to wherever it is needed, and there's not a single space on this planet where it isn't needed. It's needed everywhere. But where do we go most specifically where people aren't hearing it or aren't feeling it or experiencing it, or there's some sort of barrier that's preventing them from doing that? And so, I go around and I constantly make myself uncomfortable to talk about how Wesley made himself uncomfortable going into the fields, and remind people that sometimes God calls us into these uncomfy spaces. But there's a bigger plan there, a bigger reason there.
So I know, because of our shared experience on the pilgrimage, and also work that you and I have done together, that an important part of John Wesley's thinking, his theology, had to do with these places of discomfort. So spending time with the impoverished or the unhoused or those in prisons, somehow releases an experience of the grace of God. John Wesley used the term means of grace. And I know, and we have a mutual friend and colleague, Paul Chilcote, who talks about the renewing energy when we serve others and walk with others across those uncomfortable spaces. And some of the work I'm doing with this cohort that I'm leading right now is to form relationships across racial, socioeconomic, and other boundaries for the purpose of experiencing love under pressure, as theologian Jörg Rieger would say. Could you just say a word to how John Wesley saw discomfort as somewhat an essential element of love?
I think this is one of those spaces where, I try to put on my theologian hat every now and then, but I'm definitely not a theologian. But if the way that I understand Wesley is, if we are truly experiencing the love of God, right, and that's kind of on that personal holiness level, then we cannot sit and just experience it. We have to go out and live it. It's almost an immediate response. And our love of God, especially in the Wesleyan form, is meant to bring us comfort, right? That idea of assurance, but to compel us into those uncomfortable spaces. So how do I go out and take the love of God to places I would not have previously gone? How do I, and for Wesley, he did this not only in the fields, but by traveling throughout Britain and Ireland. He did this in kind of making himself, I guess, ecclesiastically uncomfortable. I'll say it that way, by, trusting laypersons to preach. That was a huge move into an uncomfortable space for John Wesley. He was very much kind of a control freak and a narcissist a little bit. But here he is kind of handing over the reins to lay people who aren't theologically educated. But he sees that the Spirit of God is moving in them and that they have something to say and that people can learn about different ways to experience the love of God from different types of people. And so he moves into that uncomfy space, not only physically, but also kind of ecclesiologically by empowering laypersons and eventually women to speak. And then by, kind of ordaining, taking on the power of ordination and ordaining persons for ministry in America. But if we really are feeling the love of God in a Wesleyan fashion, there's kind of no limit to the places and spaces that we should feel called to go.
So if we go back to that building dating back to 1739 or 1740, the New Room, this little wooden building, it became a hospital. It became a feed, right? People were fed there. And I know there's a lot of conversation today about, did church buildings maintain these sort of institutional holy spaces, or do they also serve the community? And while that's rather controversial today in the United Methodist Church in the United States, do we have food pantries? Do we let folks into our building? That was not really a conversation for Wesley from day one. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he saw needs and immediate needs that he could meet through some sort of collaborative physical space. So for him, it was going out and hearing from the people in the immediate community and saying, what do you need? And then he went out and figured out, okay, how can I meet that need? Right. So a lot of people, to get into a little bit of British history, the parish system was collapsing, and the parish system had been the support system that provided healthcare and food access and employment and religious services. And as populations across the 18th century were shifting and moving from rural to urban areas, the parish system collapsed. And so Wesley begins this Methodist movement in the midst of that collapse, right? So in today's world, we might think of, access to healthcare, access to food, like a lot of the same problems in the 18th century are still problems today. Access to libraries and uncensored reading materials. So how can we meet those needs that everyday people have, and do so from a single space where people know, like, okay, I can't afford bread today, or, my head is hurting and I know that I have a fever. Where can I go for medicine? Or like, I am feeling really alone today. Where can I go for company? And he built that space as a central hub for whatever needs you might have. And it was constantly adapting to needs as well. And that's one of those spaces where I think today we could really learn from is, so many of our local churches, start a ministry, and that ministry is great and it meets an immediate need, but maybe the need changes, but that ministry doesn't. And so how do we do some of that adaptive, responsive change in how we're engaging with the community as the community changes?
I think one of the things that can prevent us from engaging the needs that are around us, whatever it might be, is the fear of that which is messy, right? The fear of that which is not only personally uncomfortable, but it might damage our space or the carpet or whatever it might be, property values. Um, where have you experienced, either in your own life or as a historian, living out the love of Jesus in community that can look messy and beautiful together? How can those two things go together?
I think one of the spaces that immediately comes to mind is, and you and I have done some of this ministry together, is kind of in the realm of church outside of your normal settings, right? Where you blur some lines or some decorum of the institutional church in order to take the message of God's love into new spaces. So what immediately comes to mind is beer and hymns, right? A lot of my mom started a beer and hymns back in Arkansas, probably 20 years ago. And it was very much a messy space. She was the preacher's wife. She was a minister in herself, but in this idea, she was seen as the preacher's wife, right? Going out and getting Sunday school started in pubs and singing hymns. And that was kind of that messy space that she was toying around in. But it turned into a separate nonprofit that now raises tens of thousands of dollars every year for its local community.
Can I just ask you to explain a little bit more, what is beer and hymns? I mean, you touched on it.
Yeah. So beer and hymns, you find a local pub that is willing to hand over their stage or their microphone for a night. Some places do it once a week, some places do it once a month, some once a year. And you gather around and you just sing hymns. You get a band together and they sing hymns. You can mix it with, contemporary pop or classic pub songs. But the idea is just to kind of normalize singing hymns in public and find a place that isn't inside of a church where people can experience that love of God, whether it is over a tonic and lime or an IPA, right? It's just a community space where people can come together and sing some of the beloved hymns of various traditions.
Did your mom get a lot of resistance and pushback?
Oh, yes. So much. And it was one of those funny things of, it wasn't, I don't think my mom got the immediate pushback, but my dad did. And it was very much in that Southern way of, do you know what your wife's doing? And he was like, I do. and then it became a husband putting on the boss hat, which never worked well. It was very Susanna and Samuel reminiscent of, pushing the boundaries.
John Wesley's parents that weren't always of the same mind.
They were not always of the same mind. And Susanna was, or I guess my mother was just as strong-willed as Susanna and just as willing to experiment with ministry as she was.
I didn't realize she started that. I didn't realize that was your personal connection to that movement. And that's now a 501c3 nonprofit organization with a website.
With a website in Arkansas, and they pop up all over. But she started one specifically in Arkansas. It was modeled after others around, but she brought it to Arkansas.
And we've experimented with it twice so far in New Jersey. Yeah. I love that. I used to play in a band for a worship service at Riverside Church in Manhattan back when I was in seminary. Worked with Mark Miller, our common friend and colleague. And Mark put a band together to plant this service called Space for Grace. And it met every Wednesday at Riverside Church, which is this, one of the largest steeples in the United States, very, very prominent Protestant church. And at the time, Reverend Dr. Jim Forbes, who was like the preacher's preacher, I got to drink from the fountain of his preaching every Wednesday. And that service was in their, like a fellowship hall, huge stone building, not in their cathedral nave, but downstairs. And it was more like gospel music, R&B, very much Mark Miller style music. And you could come for soup and bread every Wednesday. I think it was 6:00, soup and bread for free. And then you stayed for worship. And so, of course, the band, we came early so we could eat for free because we were poor students. And then we would play the service. But it attracted, it's in West Harlem, it attracted folks who were unhoused, folks with all kinds of social issues, as well as professors at Columbia and Union and everything in between. And when I think about beautiful and messy, I think particularly about one Wednesday where there was this man. One thing that was, I think it's hilarious. I would never do it today in that service, but they gave an open mic prayer time. You can imagine, like it sometimes would be 30 minutes, people going on about their thing in this prayer time. And they had people walking around with mics. And this man, who I believe was a Vietnam veteran, probably some sort of mental illness, PTSD, got a mic. And if he didn't talk 20 minutes, I don't know how long he was talking. Everyone was terrified. We were all terrified. I think we were trying to look around, like, do we play music? He was just ranting about the president and no one caring about Vietnam vets and the United States. Like, he just carried on and on and on. And Jim Forbes, the pastor, slowly grabbed him another microphone and he just slipped up behind the man. The guy didn't even know he was there. And he just put his arm around the man's shoulder. This guy's like ranting and yelling. And Jim Forbes, Dr. Forbes, says, let us all just take a time to pray with our brother. And the guy just stopped talking. Dr. Forbes led this amazing prayer. Someone came, took the mic from the man, gently. He sat down and we went on with worship. Nobody admonished the man. Nobody said we can't do this again. It was just like, this kind of community is always going to be messy if you give out free bread and soup. But we're going to continue to do that. Anyway, I share that with great affection for Dr. Forbes and that experience. As we kind of wrap up our time talking about the love of made real in our Methodist tradition, I want to ask you a different question than I'm asking some other podcast guests. For you, I would ask, what is the present moment and possibility that is deeply connected with the Methodist movement of the 1700s? What are you seeing as our current opportunities to engage in the same power of making love tangible as founded in John and Charles Wesley?
And I would point to probably the dozens of parallels that I can make between church today and state today and kind of the affairs of the world today and John Wesley's day. We hinted at some of them, kind of in this episode, but not only kind of people's, access to basic needs of life are dwindling, but also there's a strong disconnect between people aren't necessarily feeling comfortable or pulled to go into a sanctuary on Sunday morning. And I think that's one of the biggest parallels that we see between our day and John Wesley's. And so the question becomes, okay, that doesn't mean that they aren't spiritual or religious or that they aren't feeling the love of God or expressing the love of God. That just means they aren't doing it in church on a Sunday. And so how do we connect with those people? How do we harness that energy and be creative with it? And a lot of that does involve making ourselves uncomfortable because we've gotten so used to doing church a certain way at a certain time with certain rules and time limits on, speeches and standards of decorum. But unless we're willing to kind of put some trust in God and trust in each other and be willing to love one another no matter what, no matter how long our speeches go on, no matter, the flack we might get for taking hymns out into a pub, right? No matter the pushback that we might get, recognizing that if the end goal is getting the love of God out there and bringing others to the love of God so that they can continue kind of in this push-pull or kind of reverberation of God's love out into the world. I think that's what we need to focus on. And that's where the parallel is that the crisis in the church, the crisis in the world is so similar. And John Wesley was able to harness a space to meet need. And that's what we have to do, is how do we harness that space where we can meet people's needs in new and creative ways? And I think back in Wesley's day too, technology was changing, the way people communicated was changing, and we're seeing a lot of that change today too. So how can we, I could go on and on and on about the parallels, but I think the biggest thing is there's a lot of change and a lot of need out there, and we have to get creative and push some boundaries in order to meet that.
Some of the conversations you and I are having professionally and how we get this message out is how you connect content creation, which this is, to community, which is what you need to experience and share love, to social engagement, to working for justice and meeting the hurts and needs of the world. And I want to say that you have such a profound voice in the life of the United Methodist Church right now, a witness that is very needed, a witness all your own, but also calling us to a deeper witness from our past. And I just want to thank you so much for your friendship, but also thanks for taking your time to proclaim a little field preaching today to the friends I'm working with for this podcast. You are definitely a light and a blessing, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. And thank you for all the work that you're doing, not only with this project, but in the greater church as well. You've been a true friend and a true partner in ministry. So
can't wait to see what happens next. Take care.
Love the Goal is a production of Pews Media, with executive producer and host Chris Heckert, and editing and production help from Phil Fizur and Megan Martin. For more information, visit us online at twopews.org. We hope you'll join us again soon.